Rubenstein, surprise show drop because it is signing day. Yes, they have altered the calendar this year. Of course, they had to cram everything into this already busy week. Where we've got coach hirings and coach firings and the championship games coming up. Alas, now we also have signing day, as they have finagled the calendar a little bit here to be more conducive to the student athlete, I suppose.
Yeah.
Welcome back, my friend. How are you?
I have grown to love December. First of all, do we have the sound?
Oh, I can find it. You caught me off guard.
Let me vamp a little bit.
Yeah.
But I have come to truly love the silly season that is the month of December. And it's mostly because college football, as a semi-ungoverned entity, has made it. There it is. Bring it up, Ty. Bring up that volume. It's a December to remember, because it always is. There's always something stupid and ridiculous and wonderful, and this is the true month-long holiday of college football is December. Between big games, between coaches moving, players moving, signing day, players arriving, players flipping, surprise stuff that happens at the beginning and middle of bowl season. I don't know. It's a cartoon, and I love it. What I was going to say is, this is the time of year that makes being a college football fan incredible, horrible, or it puts up such a barrier of entry to understand this sport that I almost feel like I have devoted my professional life to the intricacies of, like, here's what an agent does.
Yeah.
Here's what a GM does. Here's what the term Wilt Fong bomb or whatever it is, a Fong bomb is.
Fong bomb. Yeah, come on.
Like, he does a great job. I love the specialization of, there's a search firm. What's a search firm? Like, there is so much so specific about December. And I know you're a big portal guy. You love the chaos of the portal.
The portal is my thing. That is my baby. Yeah.
I look at this as a buffet, as a tasting menu, as just nonstop. We just had Thanksgiving. This month is my Thanksgiving. That the dishes and calories keep on coming.
Welcome back, one. Welcome back, all. Today's episode is going to be your National Signing Day preview / primer / basically everything we can pry out of Brandon Huffman of 247 Sports. Brandon has been one of our long-time guests on this show. He stops by at least once a year for this very episode to talk through not always the specifics of who is signing where, but as we do on this show, the bigger picture type things that I think our audience cares about, especially in this new world order of college football, where you've got agents and NIL plays a factor and the transfer portal, and Andrew Luck is now a general manager for a school. So many things have changed. This is kind of our yearly check-in with Brandon to find out what has changed, where have things gone in the recruiting world. And furthermore, you got stories like Bryce Underwood. You've got rising teams like Michigan, frankly, in the recruiting rankings that have come on strong as of late. Colorado, another one of those schools. Who are the risers? Who are the fallers? Who are the names he would invest some of his money in? We've got a lot to discuss with our good friend.
Yeah, it's sort of what goes on behind the scenes, what goes into a lot of these decisions, what goes into recruitment and commitments and decommitments, and where all the pieces sort of fit together. It's never been more confusing, but it's also never been more fascinating. And people are obviously down on the state of college football with how money has influenced things and how NIL and portal and all that stuff has influenced things. But it's fascinating to learn about all of the reasons why things are happening and all the players involved. So I don't know. I find it fascinating, even if at times I find it sort of discouraging, but I don't know. That's my sort of life, I guess, in a nutshell. So great. It's fun.
Great. Absolutely. So this is a rare drop to the feed on Wednesday. I don't know how long this is going to go.
Yeah.
We're going to get as much out of Brandon as we possibly can with,
we're going to wring him dry.
Yeah. Out of the time that we've got available here, we will still be doing, it goes without saying, hopefully our week 15 / championship week preview. That's going to drop to the feed bright and early on Thursday morning. You can catch the video out on YouTube. Of course, stay plugged into all of our episodes by clicking follow or subscribe wherever it is you like your podcasts. And you can always go on out to verballers.com. That is our Patreon, where you get the ad-free episodes, the bonus content, be part of our Discord community, play in our Run the Board game, which we will talk more about on tomorrow's episode. A lot going on out there, especially this time of year. There's been a big uptick in interest because of the playoff, and we've had crazy tiebreakers, and just there's a lot going on, a lot whizzing around out there in the Verballerhood. We'd love to have you just give us a look out at verballers.com, Dan. Should we dive in? Should we chat with Brandon?
And with that, we are now joined by the legend. That's a capital T, capital L, the legend, Brandon Huffman, 247 Sports. I don't like it when people say this about us, so I'm not going to say this about you. When people are like, oh, this is like the OGs, these are the legends. Like, no. A young upstart Brandon Huffman. How about that?
I like it. First time I called young in a long time.
I mean, it's all relative, right? Yeah. You're not young compared to the people you cover regularly, but I think generally speaking, you've been around older people, and that counts.
Yeah, I'm young compared to like politicians, right?
Have you found yourself in at a camp and been noticeably older than a recruit's parents often?
Oh yeah, I'm now finally covering second generation, where like I covered their dads, and I kind of feared when this day would happen,
right?
Because they were really young. I remember like the one come to Jesus moment I had was when Kelvin Taylor signed. I mean, Fred Taylor and I were the same age. And Kelvin was signing, and I was like, man, my kids are like 9 and he's already got a kid signing. Well, now I'm like, yeah, I better interviewed your dad way back in the day. Oh, yeah, he remembers that. I'm like, how does he remember that? I can't even remember that. Only reason I remember it because you're a junior. And I'm like, I think I covered your dad. And yes, we've hit that age now where, it's usually whenever Brett McMurphy wishes somebody a happy birthday. And he's like, oh, he's 21. He's the youngest coach in America. I'm like, dude, he's younger than some of my own children are. And I was doing this job before my kids were born.
Was there one player where you were just like, oh, this is, I know like Fred Taylor, maybe from afar, but that you covered both father and son. They're like, oh, this is a very real moment.
Yeah, it kind of doesn't necessarily count because he was a JUCO transfer, and I think he was a returning missionary. But it was the running back who he went to Utah. The son was a Utah target, and then he had to sign with BYU in the 2023 class. And I'm completely blanking on the name, but I covered his dad one of those early years, and he's like, "Oh yeah, my dad said you interviewed him back in the day." I'm like, "Good Lord, how are we at this point already?"
It is, man. The world does not stop spinning. Easy segue there for me. Speaking of which, we're recording this. This is your disclaimer. We're recording this, I don't know, 12 hours before the official early National Signing Day. What are the disclaimers you have right now about what people may see in terms of the rhythm of this all? Obviously, there are people yet to flip in the next 24 hours or even 6 weeks or whatever. What are the disclaimers that you would like to give people about the class of 2025 and following it as news?
Yeah, I mean, the first one is this is the earliest signing period ever. It's 2 weeks earlier than when it moved to December. It's now the first Wednesday. We got the portal in, less than a week. And we now have they're no longer signing NLIs, National Letters of Intent. We were already confusing everybody with the two acronyms being similar, NIL and NLI. But now they're signing financial aid agreements. And what that means is that the school is now bound more than the player is bound in what was considered the most one-sided contracts in sports. And tomorrow starts the early signing period. It ends on Friday, but don't be surprised if you see some guys that have been committed to a school very long, not sign on a Wednesday and maybe take us down to Friday. That's what we like to call the negotiation era. And schools are coming in late with better offers. This isn't about, in the old days where you had the flips where the kid who was the best player in like a lower Power 5 or a non-BCS school,
right,
he ends up becoming the 24th or 25th best player in the local school. I mean, Dan, how many times did we see that with USC back in the early 2000s where a guy would be the headliner of Oregon State, Washington State, and then Pete Carroll would come in at the last minute, offer the kid, knowing the kid was going to be the 25th best player, but the kid would commit. Well, now it's not about flipping because you want to go play for your dream school. It's because you want to go be able to buy your dream house. And the agents have gotten way more involved in the last couple of hours and the last couple of days of the recruiting period. So just because a guy might have been committed to your school for 2 years, a year and a half, if somebody makes him an offer he can't refuse, he's not going to refuse it.
What's been the general strategy of the savviest agents or representatives of recruits in 2024? Is it the like last second visit to sort of put the heat under the school that a recruit is currently committed to? Is it, floating things on social media? Is it all of the above? What is the general strategy of those who are playing the game? I don't know if the word correctly is the way to go, but playing the game most shrewdly.
It's definitely all the above. I mean, it's float out here that we may want this other guy, or that, this guy might have got an offer. You're seeing some last minute offers going out to players that maybe aren't the caliber of that school's roster, but they're getting an offer, but it might be a preferred walk-on type offer where it's like, hey, we're going to give you NIL to cover your tuition and housing, but you're not going to be a revenue generating player, but we really want this other guy. So if we offer you, then he's going to freak out.
Right.
And you're starting to see schools that are, floating out who their portal targets might be. You might see an article saying, well, if the portal were to open, these might be the 14 guys that might go into the portal and our school might sign to ramp things up. So you're seeing a lot more power plays being done on the college side, but what you're also seeing is that the colleges don't have the power they think that they did. It's in the old days where they had the power. Now the player can turn around and, they're not giving up what these numbers are. They're not giving up what these figures are. And they're going back and saying, hey, I was telling you guys off there, I spent a year working for Scott Boras way back in the 90s. And I remember, right after I started there, or right before I started there, it was when the infamous Bernie Williams basically having the Yankees negotiating against the Yankees, and how Scott Boras just floated out that the Red Sox were interested, and all of a sudden the Yankees came up with an offer and the Red Sox were like, oh, we never were interested. Well, now you're getting some numbers floating out that aren't necessarily verifiable and aren't necessarily accurate, but then schools are essentially bidding against themselves. So you're seeing it happen on both sides, but now with the players having more power than they ever had and the schools kind of having less power than they ever had, it's starting to see the tables getting turned a little bit.
As somebody who has a name in this business, Brandon, you kind of fit into this equation as well.
Mm-hmm. Are you guys used? Is that what Ty is saying?
Are guys trying to play you?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
do you have to put on your investigator hat to figure out who's trustworthy and who isn't, and who is just trying to use you as a vessel to, I don't know, get a better NIL agreement or get a better transfer or just get something out there that benefits one side or another?
Yeah, I mean, and I know when I'm getting played because I'm not an idiot. I've been doing this long enough to know. I mean, I got kids. I got teenage kids. I know when I'm getting played. So I'm able to vet that a lot quicker. I got played last year by a portal kid, and I knew I was getting played. But I was preparing because just in case this portal situation did end up happening, I was going to have the story. And then I didn't get the story. The agent gave it to somebody much more powerful who you see on your television on Saturdays, and he had the story. And, that's when I got pissed because am I allowed to say that? No, because I got played, even though, I knew going into it. And so I'm a lot more cynical now when it becomes to getting played. And I know when I am. And there's also times like, hey, you know what? Find somebody else. They can tweet it. I'm not getting involved in that. I still just want to report on where you're going, when you're committing, and when you're signing. But you're getting a lot more leverage plays on both sides. Or a school might say, hey, this school might look to sign this extra quarterback, or they may not sign another quarterback in this class. They may not sign a linebacker in this class. They may just go heavy in the portal to try to freak out some of those targets that are waffling a little bit. And I don't usually get into that either, because then I got, I don't want an entire fan base trying to torch me on Twitter. But no, absolutely. And I think that's where, being in this industry as long as I am, and being in a pre-social media era, but also being in a heavy social media era, I know when guys are getting sheftered.
Do you find that with representatives of recruits that there are actual Scott Boras types who, like, if somebody asked you, if a parent, in your neighborhood or something happened to have a 4 or 5 star kid and say, like, who would you go with because we can't make heads or tails of the process? Are there actual, I'm not going to say legit because that implies that it's a wild world, which obviously it probably is, but like, are there like the A-list type agencies that are buttoned up, that have actual lawyers looking at these deals and changing language and making sure that, everybody's taken care of properly? Like, are those, people emerging?
Oh yeah. I mean, you're going to have your athletes first. You're going to have your WME. You're going to have Clutch. You're going to have guys that are tied to major sports management firms that are representing the top NFL and the NBA and the MLB players. You're going to have those guys, but they're not, going after low hanging fruit. They're going after
Right.
the guys that they know they're going to be sitting in the green room with in 3 years from now, in 4 years from now. It's not uncommon for those high powered attorneys, right? And I know guys that are at those athletes first and Clutch and the different, major kind of agencies. And, they're the ones that are representing the top guys. The guys are going to be on a Dr. Pepper commercial, the guys that are going to be, involved in the major brands because they're playing the 15-year game. They're not playing the 3-year game, the short-term game. They're playing the long game. And their percentages might even be less than what some of the NIL collective kind of management firms are getting right now because they know that they're bound by NFLPA rules in a couple of years. So they're not trying to get out ahead of their skis. They want to hold on to this guy when he's really making money.
Right.
So you have that, but they're focusing on that 1%. Then you have kind of the mom and pop shops, the guys that, they have a social media account and they've got a couple of guys. And a lot of times you're seeing, I'm told so-and-so is going into the portal from his agents, the athletes first, the William Morris's and the Clutches don't need to put who they're represented by. They don't need it to be tweeted out that they're represented by. Those guys, we all know who they are anyway. So
Right.
You're definitely seeing the involvement from the higher powered sports management firms, but they're kind of just laying in the distance because they really are playing the long game.
Brandon, the big story, I guess, in the early wave of recruiting news has been Bryce Underwood. Originally committed to LSU, waffled a bit, now has flipped to Michigan, reportedly to the tune of $12.5 million. Where that money is coming from, maybe you can help shed some light on that. Can you shed some light, just broadly speaking, on what that recruitment has been like? And furthermore, if Bryce Underwood is worth it, because that's a lot of money. We know Michigan wants a better quarterback situation. All you had to do was watch the game this past weekend, which they won. Could have done better if they had some better quarterback play. Can you shed some light on what transpired there and maybe your personal opinion on whether it all makes sense to do?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when NIL was first starting to get off the ground in 2021, and you started to see what, we came in an era where there was the bag man, right? Where the bag man was paying specific positions, but the one position that always seemed to be avoided in securing the bag, so to speak, was quarterback. A lot of times those guys, had the resources that they didn't need to get paid. They just wanted to go play in an NFL system, be developed, and get a chance to go to the NFL because they knew they were going to get paid when they got to the NFL. Well, now you're seeing that quarterbacks are dictating the market. It's quarterbacks, left tackles, and pass rushers are kind of the big three which is unlike the NFL, but those are the three that are getting the biggest NIL money. And we're seeing that, with an elite effective quarterback, you have a chance to win very early. And, Michigan had a game manager and JJ McCarthy turned into a first rounder, won him a national championship, took him to a couple playoffs, but the drop off was dramatic this year. And so when you have an elite quarterback in your backyard, and remember, if Michigan had really focused on Dante Moore 2 years ago, perhaps this conversation is a lot different. Maybe, he's the start of this year. He backs up JJ McCarthy last year. He's the start of this year. And there's no drop off from JJ McCarthy to Dante Moore, the local kid from Detroit, who continues to run it. But instead, they didn't get him. And then when they lost Underwood, kind of on the heels of Harbaugh's, will he or won't he go to the NFL? Sherrone Moore being an offensive line guy, wants to be a run first, win in the trenches guy. I think that looked like the cause was lost. And then the quarterback play really tapered off. And I think that there became the need, like, we got to do whatever we can to get Bryce Underwood here. And I think that Underwood saw that, maybe the big reason for LSU's offensive success was Jaden Daniels, was Mike Denbrock. Well, Mike Denbrock's no longer in Baton Rouge, and the offense isn't clicking nearly like it should. And wow, Michigan really has some issues, and it's close to home. And, here comes Larry Ellison. I mean, is he worth it? It's not my money to dictate if he's worth it.
Right.
That's the big thing. I have a whole other side philosophy on that, but the point is, like, if you're Michigan and you're now understanding that revenue generation and revenue sharing is coming, you need some of that collective money, but you also are going to be getting some from these TV deals. So yeah, it's worth it. The further along in the playoffs you get, the further along you win, the more gear you sell, the more money you're going to have to share. And an elite quarterback from your backyard is absolutely worth it.
I have read comparisons to Patrick Mahomes, Vince Young,
Cam Newton,
like all of these high profile guys who have come out of college and have been successful to varying degrees at the NFL. Which comparison is the most apt for Underwood?
Yeah, Vince Young was such a unicorn, and so was Cam Newton. But as good as Vince Young was, Texas was really talented back then.
right?
Cam Newton, I mean, I've been watching college football since 1982. All right. I would say that, I mean, Ty, you'll appreciate this. I'll still stand on that. And it's because I'm showing my age. But to me, Rocket Ishmael was the most exciting college football player I ever saw. And I was a high school kid when he was in college. I mean, Reggie Bush was also pretty dang good. But the single greatest season I ever saw in the history of college football had to have been that Cam Newton year. And what he did, I don't think anybody physically can do what Cam Newton did. So I think it's probably closer to a Vince Young where he's talent, there's talent around him, and he's going to elevate that talent because of how dynamic he is. I think it's unfair to compare anybody to Cam Newton because he was such a unicorn in college and even in the NFL. And, I always hate trying to do it's plus it's easier when Cam Newton won a Heisman, Vince Young didn't. So you're not comparing him to a Heisman winner, and we're not guaranteeing him. We're not Ron Collising him. But
Right.
I would say that there's a lot more of the Vince Young factor than there is Cam Newton, which is still a pretty dang, high bar if we're being candid.
Let me take a different spin on the money question for a second. And let's assume that we're not talking Bryce Underwood. He's already spoken for. Brandon Huffman, let's say textile magnet.
Mm-hmm.
You've come into money. You care about college football. You want your team. We don't even need to name a team to excel. Where are you spending your money? Of the other available players, who are you going after from this class that you think is worth the money, if not Bryce Underwood?
From a pure investment standpoint.
Yeah.
From a pure, so you want like names of the players, like who are the guys that I want that guy? He's going to be a generational difference maker.
I want to know who you'd go after.
Honestly, I think a guy like Elijah Griffin, who's going to Georgia. And you look at what Georgia did in those two national championship seasons, they kicked your butt at the line of scrimmage on the defensive side of the ball. That front seven was disgusting. When Nolan Smith's like your third best defensive lineman, that tells you how good you are up front. And, I would say defensive lineman. And again, I'm one of those weird West Coast guys that when I see a 6'3", 225-pound wannabe tight end, I'm like, dude, if you were in the South, you'd be wearing number 59. You'd be coming off the edge.
Yep.
Go make yourself some money over there. Don't go be a slow receiver. Go play defense. So I feel like, in this era, that defense is the difference. But then, you have these two I think the national championship game last year gives you arguments for both sides. Michigan won because they just dominated you up front. Their defensive line, their defense in general, but with Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant and the way that defense took over games. But then Washington, with many of the same players that were there under Chris Peterson or recruited by Chris Peterson and there for the Jimmy Lake disaster, Michael Penix took them from a team that lost at home to Montana to playing in the national championship game 2 years later with many of the same players, but Penix made that big of a difference. So, there's an argument for both. My personal philosophy would be get as good a defensive alignment as you can. And, if you can get a quarterback, the next guy you go after is a defensive lineman because that one guy can change the entire complexion of your front seven, which changes the entire complexion of a lot of games if you're getting a pass rush on that quarterback. And I think a guy like him is where you put your money. But, David Sanders, he's also in the conversation because you need somebody to protect your prized possession at quarterback. Is that what it is? But I also think that, we look at how crucial Caleb Downs was to Alabama and even to Ohio State, this season. An elite DB is also starting to become much more desirable. You think about it, 7 years ago, the number one player in the country, the most heavily recruited player was Najee Harris. He was a running back. And, Bama got it. Michigan wanted him. But at the end of the day, if you look at what was the most crucial part of that Alabama recruiting class, well, it was receivers. It was the Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, getting, Mac Jones and Tua Tagovailoa in the same class, but all anybody wanted to talk about was Najee. So we're seeing that the game has changed where you need a quarterback. If you've got some elite offensive linemen, great. Throw a receiver in there because one receiver can make a huge difference, unless you're running Chip Kelly's offense, in which you get the most generational receiver ever and avoid him for an entire half. But I think, a quarterback first, a defensive lineman second, then I mean left tackle or a big play explosive wide receiver.
How's this year's quarterback class after Bryce Underwood? Who do you like? What is the depth like? Who do you think might have a steal? Where does this year's class stack up in terms of recent years?
It's really good. I mean, the top 3 players in our class are all quarterbacks. Underwood going to Michigan, then you've got Keon Russell going to Alabama, and then you got Tavian St. Clair going to Ohio State. So it's just good to see Alabama and Ohio State are finally able to just get some things to break their way when it comes to quarterbacks. And you could make an argument for any of those 3 as being the best player in this class. I mean, if you really look at from a competition level, Keon Russell is probably the closest to Kyler Murray in the sense that here he is, a star in the biggest stage in high school football, winning the biggest division in the state of Texas and competing on that level. I mean, this is a guy that Rhett Lashley thought he got a steal a year ago when he was coming to SMU. And then here comes Kalen DeBoer coming in with, Michael Penix in his back pocket, even Jake Haener. And now Keelan Russell's going to Alabama. That's the kind of gravitas that Kalen DeBoer had with Michael Penix, but also what Alabama can do over SMU. And, he's ascended from being like a back end top 247 guy to the number 2 player in the country and could be the best player in the country. Tavion St. Clair, kind of the same thing. I mean, here's a guy who's elite, but he's going to go to a very crowded room where you've got Devin Brown, you've got Leakin Canholz, you've got Aaron Nolan, you've got Julian Sand, who transferred in from Alabama. So those 3 guys are elite. I mean, we talked about the class from 2 years ago a lot. I think we did on the show. You had Nico, you had Arch Manning, you had Dante Moore and Jaden Rashada and Malachi Nelson. Well, right now it's basically Nico. Arch has shown those flashes. Dante Moore will probably get a chance to be the guy next year. Will Jaden Rashada even play at Alabama or at Georgia? Is Malachi Nelson never going to see the field? Is he going to transfer again? So that's the only hesitancy. When we saw what we thought was a generational quarterback class, it hasn't broken as such. And that's where, schools that still develop their quarterbacks, I think in this day and age, it's still important to develop your quarterbacks because the transfer portal quarterback crop is going to be pretty mediocre this year. And that's partly because we're seeing so much bouncing around.
Yeah, true. And it's also been a season. Quarterbacks are usually decided a year and a half ahead of time, at least. It's been a season.
And to that point, just not to take you off, but just, you had in this class, Faisal Brandon, who was the number 1 player in the country, was going to wait till December to announce his decision. And then he ended up moving it to August because schools were already telling him, the number 1 player in the country, they were already telling him, hey, we need a decision because we're going to move on.
This is 26, too.
This is 26. He hadn't even started his junior year of high school. And I was at Folsom High School last month, and I was talking to Ryder Lyons, who's the number 2 quarterback in the country, top 5 player. And he's planning to serve an LDS mission for at least a year. But he's the only one of the few quarterbacks that feels like I don't need to decide just yet because I'm still not really enrolling until 2027. But that's how sped up things are. Where now the quarterbacks that haven't even started their junior year are almost being pushed. Hey, make a decision now. We're just going to move on because we need to have something, in the chambers.
So this has been a class, though. We've had Julian Lewis committed to USC forever. He flips. It's Longstreet from A&M, then flips to USC. Cal has a quarterback committed who seems to be coveted by Oregon. And so it's been a sort of later stage dominoes. How normal is this? Do you like those guys? And sub question with Julian Lewis leaving USC, what has happened to USC's class?
Yeah, well, there's 2 parts to that question. The first one, I'll say that the dominoes are surprising because when the quarterback dominoes fall, it's like you said, it's a year before. It's when this guy commits, then we know, hey, we might have a chance for this guy. But once we know we're out, then we can move on this guy. And then everything kind of just falls into place as a result of that. I mean, Cal went from having Robert McDaniel, who I like a lot. He's committed to Arizona, but they wouldn't have even had a chance at Jaron if Robert McDaniel had stayed committed. And he decommitted on Memorial Day. 6 days later, Jaron's at their camp. Jaron Songapolatelli, number one player in Hawaii. That's who you're talking about. It's covered by Oregon. He goes to their camp, gets an offer. At that point, his only offers, like he had an old offer from Washington, from Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer, but DeBoer didn't recruit him in Alabama. So his top schools going into June were Utah State, Boise State, and Oregon State. All right, two Mountain West schools and a former Pac-12 school. Now they're all going to be future Pac-12 schools. Cal only offered him because 5 days earlier they lost their quarterback commit. They end up getting him, but then they realized we're going to have to hold on to this kid. And then Georgia offers, and then Oregon offers, and now they're going to have to battle with Oregon all the way to the end. But the dominoes fall that big. They don't fall 3 days before signing day. Even remember when Dante Moore flipped 2 years ago, that was so rare to have a quarterback flip that late because usually they're so all in with their class. They're so all in with where they're
recruiters.
They're the Pied Piper, right? You want your quarterback commit early because he's going to attract receivers and the linemen and all that. So it was kind of crazy how that happened. And at the same time, I had written a column for John Wilner back in the spring where I said, this is the one thing with SC. They went through this last year. With Lincoln Riley not focusing on Southern California like Clay Helton did, like Steve Sarkisian did, Kiffin or Pete Carroll did, and doing this national and being on the record saying, hey, I don't necessarily think we have to recruit in our backyard. We can recruit nationally. Well, the problem is when you go after a kid from Georgia or a kid from Texas or a kid from Florida and you get him in April or May, you now have 9 months to babysit him. Right. And you can't do that when you're not there. You can do that a little bit more when you're with a local kid. You can get him to come to campus, get him to come to games, but now you're also getting him to commit early and telling Georgia and Florida and Texas and Alabama and Auburn how much harder they have to recruit this kid. Okay, he committed to SC. Now we know who our real toughest
and you set the market, right? You're setting the NIL market as well. Yeah,
100%. You're setting the market. Okay, what are they giving you? Okay, cool. We got that. That's easy. Give us 8 months to get that and we'll get it. And I mean, Juju was kind of the worst kept secret for the last 3 or 4 months. And it felt really, you go back to the summer, that things were trending away. And, I think that they upgraded because I love Houston Longstreet in terms of, he's a local kid. He's a Southern California kid. Corona Centennial kids are usually some of the most well-coached kids you're going to find in high school football. They're usually, they're the best public school in California. They play a tough competition, tough schedule every year. And, we've seen a lot of those Centennial kids go on. So I think, if you're USC, 80 to 90% of your class should still be Southern California or West
or
Coast
even West Coast. Yeah.
Yeah. West Coast kids. Go to Utah, go to Arizona, go to Colorado, get those elite guys, but focus on the West. And that was the danger. And so they just, they were fortuitous enough that they could keep recruiting Longstreet, and him being a Southern California kid, he probably saw the Caleb Williams era, and, he was probably old enough to remember maybe, how SC was under Sam Darnold. Faithfully, on the sidebar, we've gone away from that. Oh yeah, Reggie Bush is my favorite college player. Like, dude, Reggie Bush was out of the NFL by the time you were born. That's how young you are. But you see the Caleb Williams and what he did the previous 2 years during those real formative years for a quarterback. And so I think USC upgraded a bit in terms of just everything, from a talent standpoint. Juju's obviously tremendously talented. Remember, he could be in the 2026 class. He was originally a 2026 guy who reclassified up. So there's still talent there. But when you're USC and you're in Southern California, the entire package of Longstreet, I think, is an upgrade just given the local roots.
Brandon, can you demystify the process of reclassification? I feel like we've heard more and more of that over the last couple of years. And while I know what it means and while Dan knows what it means, I suspect there are a great number of our listeners who don't. What does that mean?
Yeah, it means that we're going to get an entire season of being told how old Ryan Williams is, and which is great because we've gone away from the Brock Osweiler 6'7" and the McCoy Shipley roommates and all that. But I say that in a joking manner, mostly because a lot of these guys reclassify, they're holdbacks. Okay, they started high school a year later than most. I mean, there's a running joke, and Dan and I talk about this a lot, being both Southern California guys, where, a freshman in high school in Southern California is probably driving himself to school because he did 8th grade once, if not twice, and when you can play your entire senior year at the age of 19, and you could be 19 at the end of your junior year. When I turned 19, 6 weeks before I started my sophomore year in college, a lot of these guys that are reclassifying, they're still old for the class they're reclassifying up to.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
so basically what you're seeing is guys are now realizing, hey, I might be in a state that doesn't allow for NIL for high school players. I want to go get that back. I want to get it now, or I want to get to the collegiate ranks because I want to be in the NFL in 3 years. And if I stay in school for another year, that's 4 years till I'm at the NFL. It's another year till I'm getting my NIL. I can expedite everything by a year. And so a lot of times you're going to have the Ryan Williamses that are the rare young guys for their class. Uh, but the flip side is majority of the reclassifications are guys that were already a year, if not 2 years older than their own class. And they're actually kind of getting a little bit more with their age group by going up, and they have the credits because they, took 8th grade twice, but they're already taking college ready classes or high school ready classes in their second year in 8th grade. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not nearly as chivalrous as it looks. A lot of times it's like, hey, we're just trying to get to that money sooner. And I don't blame them. The quicker you can get to the money, go get to the money. But the Ryan Williams are the kind of the rare species of the guys that are that young playing their freshman year.
There is not like a Doogie Howser type of epidemic in college football. It's more just a realignment with your, I guess, normal age bracket, right?
Exactly. Or, in a lot of those cases, getting realigned with your age bracket, or even you're only a year older than the guys that you reclassified with instead of 2 years older. I mean, I joke that there were guys that were literally turning 16 in the spring of their freshman year, and, they drove themselves to camps that summer. And it's like, man, in the old days, 16 was like what you turned right before your junior year started, maybe at the end of your sophomore year, if your parents just were a little hesitant to send you to school. But now, it's very much a accepted thing that, especially on the West Coast, that chances are good you're a year older than you should be in your class, or a year older than your class because you were a super holdback or a holdback.
Man, I think Patrick Chung was 16 and a half when he enrolled at Oregon. I think he went and he didn't reclassify. I don't believe he was just young, which is wild to think about now. There's a player in this class, in the 2025 class, who's reclassifying, who has a unique situation in Jakeem Stewart, who I think has he only played 2 years of high school football?
And if that, it's been like, I think it's like 15, 16 games of high school football.
Right. So is obviously with somebody as physically talented, he's a defensive lineman from Louisiana, looking at LSU and USC, Ohio State, Oregon, schools like that. Are we getting into an era where you look at like pro drafts, you look at NBA drafts, you look at NFL drafts, and you're like, well, he's a project. He has physical tools, but he's a project. But at least they played college sports. We're now looking on an even lower level that like he's played a little bit of high school football, and these schools, because of his build, that he's broad, that he's tall, that he's quick, like are we getting into that era of just looking at measurables without actual production, or is he just a sort of rare case?
I mean, he is a rare case, although it's fascinating because, I mean, how many times have we seen the NBA draft go draft a guy who was the 11th player on his team, but he's got this ridiculous upside. He was a one and done. Right. He was 6'10", 6'11". You can't teach that. And if you were a fourth-year senior, you weren't getting drafted in the first round because something was wrong with you because you played college basketball for 4 years. Clint Brewster, who's one of our portal evaluators, tweeted something last week that I thought was pretty fascinating because I think it's accurate, is that schools are now looking in the portal for production more than projection. And I think you're seeing a lot more schools now realizing, hey, measurables can be misleading if the guy is not a good football player. He might be big, he might be fast, he might be strong, he might be athletic, but he's not a good football player. Now with rosters being shrunk, and now with 25 guys in a class, and you might want 15 out of high school and 10 out of the portal, and guys aren't willing to wait. If you try to redshirt them and develop them, you want those guys that are college ready. You don't want to stash a guy on your roster anymore. I remember there was Sean Evans' recruitment was one of the most fascinating that I can remember, because here he was, his final three was Alabama, Auburn, and UCLA. And Auburn was basically saying, hey, you're going to start next year. UCLA was losing Anthony Barr. Hey, you're going to start next year. Alabama says, hey, you could probably start your junior year, maybe not till your senior year, because we have 7 guys just like you. So don't get, in a hurry, because you're probably only going to play for 3 years. And I don't think he started a game until like the end of his junior year, starts his whole senior year, ends up being a top 10 pick. Those days are done because guys don't want to sit and wait for 3 years. They want to play right now. And especially when we get into this revenue sharing era where ability to play and your ability to make an impact on the team is going to dictate what your revenue is going to be. Guys want to play now. You're going to get less money sitting on the bench as a backup. And so I think as a result of that, schools are recalibrating what they're looking for. They still want the guys with all the measurables, but you better have the film to back it up. And stories are going to be written on the 2021 class, because for every Caleb Williams and Drake May and JJ McCarthy that were first round picks, you're going to have guys that skip their senior year of playing high school football to enroll early. I mean, Ty, I hate to bring it up, but Tyler Buckner, he's very similar to Jakeem Stewart because he's the back of his freshman year, tears his ACL his sophomore year, plays his junior year, has a tremendous year, and then enrolls early. Well, Notre Dame got a guy who played about 14 high school football games. Yeah. And there is value in being an experienced player. And I think that schools are now saying, with everything trending the way they are, we need the production more than we need the projection. And that's why you're seeing players from the Ivy Leagues, players from FCS going into the portal and being scooped up a lot quicker than the guy who was really highly touted out of high school and hasn't seen the field in 3 years. So we don't really know if he's any good because he hasn't played for 3 years. We'd rather have the guy who's kind of the known quantity, even if he played lower level football. So it's definitely reshaped how players are being evaluated.
I'm going to forget that Tyler Buckner comment because he had a very big pass completion on a fake punt against USC. Okay.
And he did bring a national championship to South Bend.
Thank you.
That's true. Don't look at the sport, but he did it.
Absolutely correct. Let's cover both ends of the spectrum here. All right. As we look at team rankings, which teams are you looking at that you say to yourself, either because of the names in the class or the quality of the class, or just the recruiting ranking associated with that team's class, who is punching above their weight right now? Again, as we record this, let's say 12 hours before it really hits the fan.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that Auburn is punching above their weight because we know what Hugh Freeze can do as a recruiter. We know what he did when he was at Ole Miss. We've seen what Auburn did a year ago. But given that they've been kind of a disaster on the field for the last couple of years, and there's always the fun Brian Harsin tweets on Sundays after Auburn loses that add to it. But I think that Auburn is certainly kind of the outlier here. I mean, we think back to when Texas A&M had the number one class 3 years ago. Yeah, Texas A&M has recruited good, but we didn't expect them to have the number one class. Auburn's kind of the one where you're like, yeah, we expect Alabama and Georgia and Ohio State and Texas and LSU and Oregon to be up there, but Auburn hasn't been great. And I would say the other school that you kind of are surprised if you look at in the top 10 is Florida, because you just think about, again, Florida's had great classes forever, but I feel like Billy Napier's been on the hot seat since the day he took the job. I mean, it was very much like the Fire Ron Zook website getting started the day Ron Zook was hired, where they were looking for reasons to get rid of Billy Napier. And so this was a class that it looked like it was going to be cataclysmically bad back in the spring. And now they're closing with a vengeance, very much like Urban Meyer used to close there when he was at Florida. So if you look at what the situations have been on the field, those are the two that are kind of like, they're doing a little better. Now, if you look
by the way, that's the buyout money versus the NIL purse. Which are we going to spend the money on? Right?
Exactly.
Are you going to fire Billy Napier and pay the buyout, or keep Billy Napier and pay the class?
Yeah. 100%. And your boosters are like, listen, you were the one that signed into that contract. I'm going to go get you money for a quarterback, not to get rid of that guy. Unless you're Texas A&M, which you have so much go to hell money that they told Jimbo Fisher to go to hell. But if you look at the two that are kind of like, hey, these aren't traditional blue bloods, how do they have top 20 classes? I would say it's Georgia Tech and TCU. And, Georgia Tech has been one of those schools where, given the fact that we're no longer in the Big Three era, we're in the Big Four era of California, Florida, Texas, and Georgia, that you would have thought Georgia Tech would be able to recruit better than they have historically, given the amount of talent in state. And so Georgia Tech being a top 20 class, getting a guy like Josh Petty, that offers from the entire country, flipping Tay Harris last week from Clemson. Are Georgia Tech fans sad about how Friday night went? Yeah, absolutely. But I think they got their guy in Brent Key, and he's recruiting as such. And then the other one's TCU. I mean, this is a team that I think got a little bit of a bump from playing in the national championship game 2 years ago. Sonny Dykes has always done a really good job recruiting in Texas, including when he was at Cal, when he stopped recruiting the Bay Area and recruited Texas. But I think TCU has done a really good job and, kind of taking advantage of the fact that Texas and Oklahoma are out of the Big 12 and kind of becoming that Big 12 top recruiting program in the state. So those are the two that I would say from a traditional standpoint, or kind of the, two of these kids are not like the other.
The flip side of that question is who is underwhelming. And I kind of
is this the Clemson question? Is that, you can just call it that, Ty.
We can call it the Clemson question. I'm going to allow Brandon, our in-house expert here, to answer that question. But I want to say that this question now in the new era of college football video gaming maybe has more context, because there are some classes, some of the usual suspects atop this ranking that you look at, okay, they've got 13 4-stars. Are those smart 4-stars in that they're going to come in and actually help this team add depth to the roster? Or is this team just padding stats? Are there programs out there that you're looking at that either you look at the class and you don't like it, regardless of what the ranking says, or programs that you just look at and say straight up, okay, maybe Clemson's the answer here, Dan. I just don't know where this program's at. It feels like they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Empty 4-stars, Ty. The Jim Mora Jr. UCLA question.
Who is underwhelming you is my question.
I would say it is Clemson. And I think, it was funny because as soon as Dan said, just call it the Clemson question, I'm like, the first school that came to mind is Clemson. Clemson was that outlier when they were winning the national championship in 2016, 2018, they were doing it with just kind of on the cusp, on the bottom end of Bud Elliott's blue chip ratio. They didn't have the elite class, but then because they were winning, because guys were getting drafted, Clemson started to recruit really well. Well, now they're barely a top 30 class. They lost one of their key players in Tay Harris last week, who flipped to Georgia Tech. And, again, when you're Clemson, now you're losing guys to Georgia Tech. It was understandable if you were Clemson, you lost a kid to Florida State, or you lost a kid to Bama, or you lost a kid to Georgia. But like Georgia Tech, it's kind of like, what is going on here? And, I think it's been much discussed about Dabo Swinney's approach to the portal and even to NIL to an extent. But we were used to seeing Clemson, even when they were having their down years, so to speak, in the last 5 years of, winning 10 games, but losing games they shouldn't, and not competing for national championships. They were still recruiting well. Well, they're kind of that rare, like, man, is there something continuing to kind of go wrong at Clemson? So I think they're kind of the one school that they're the most glaring in terms of what they had been, what they were kind of at their peak, and, what they really should be. They're really the only ones that I would say. And I think because we got to see the rise of Stanford in the Jim Harbaugh years through kind of the middle David Shaw years, Stanford was getting top 10 classes left and right. Is Stanford at risk of being left behind at the station because of their insistence on doing it the Stanford way and not the modern way? And even seeing Stanford as a top 45 class, a top 50 class, coming off these last few unsuccessful years, the fact that they aren't going to hit the portal. So you would think that they would ramp up their, they lost a commitment on Tuesday from one of their top commits in this class, and by Ukukala from the state of Utah. And like they're losing guys instead of gaining guys. And I think that that's one of those where, like, in that 2008 to 2015 era, Stanford was getting who they wanted. If you were a lineman, you were going to Stanford. If you were a quarterback, you were going to Stanford. If you were a running back, you were going to Stanford. They were getting guys drafted in the first rounds all the time. I mean, they almost changed their entire philosophy because it was ruining the APR when Christian McCaffrey and Solomon Thomas and Austin Hooper all went to the NFL before graduating. And yet they haven't adjusted to this modern era. And so you, as somebody who's covered West Coast recruiting, and I know, Dan, how many times did you see Oregon, and Ty too, as a Notre Dame guy? I mean, Stanford, Notre Dame are going after a lot of those same guys in the Midwest and on the East Coast and the South. And they were going to Stanford because Stanford was just a little bit better. And now they're not a lot better.
I want to ask about the state of the pipeline. That's been a big thing throughout the years, where some schools wouldn't even recruit certain high schools knowing that, like, oh, he's from this high school, he is a blue chip guy, he's going to this school. But now, as we've sort of seen the nationalization of the sport, anybody can see any prospect, anybody can trip anywhere, unofficially or officially. Flights go into wherever you need to get to. And we see coaches that are coaching outside of their own background footprint, right? You have Dan Lanning outside of, the South, and he's from Missouri, but Missouri, is that how you say it? He's at Georgia. Now he's in the Pacific Northwest. You have, Sark from the West Coast is at Texas. You have Sharon Moore is from, I want to say, Kansas and played at Oklahoma. He's at Michigan. And so you have guys coaching out of footprint and forging new relationships out of footprint, but have these connections in their own background footprint. What is the state of no longer being automatically going from point A to point B?
Yeah, it's funny because I think Oregon is the one that really kind of ruined the West Coast pipeline that everybody thought it was. If you went to Mater Dei, you went to USC. And Oregon had been getting players from Mater Dei going back to, Kevin Mitchell way back 20, 25 years ago. But it was really like in the last 5 to 7 years when, the pipelines that you kind of expected, those guys that were from, Southern California to stay and go play at USC like they did under Pete Carroll, and they were going to the SEC and to the Midwest, and they're going to the Big Ten. It was, the class where you had the top 3 quarterbacks in the state of California went to Ohio State, they went to Clemson, and they went to Alabama.
Yeah.
And, the kid that went to Alabama was an SC commit, and goes and he went to Mater Dei, which was an SC pipeline. He goes to Alabama, wins a Heisman, and it's pick number 1, C.J. Stroud, who would have been a natural second choice for USC. Goes to Ohio State, ends up a top 2 pick. DJ goes to Clemson, and obviously his career hasn't quite gone as expected, but 10 years ago, that didn't happen. I mean, I think back to the 2015 class where Josh Rosen and Ricky Town were the top 2 of the top quarterbacks in the country, and they went to UCLA and USC, respectively. And Sam Darnold's kind of a late bloomer, and he stays at SC, and everything changes. Well, now there's no such thing as a pipeline anymore. It's because it's a transient sport. Now you're almost better off recruiting those guys and not pissing them off when they're in high school, because you give a better chance to get them on the rebound than you do out of high school. They're going to go take their game across the country. And then if it doesn't work out, then they can come back. Then you go get them. And I think back to, when Brew McCoy left Tennessee and he ended up back at USC, or when Zach Charbonnet left Michigan and ended up at UCLA, you can go recruit those guys the second time. Just don't offend them the first time. But now these guys are wanting to leave their natural habitat and go across the country and go play on a bigger stage and go play in front of more fans and with bigger resources for NIL opportunities. And when you see guys from the West Coast going to Georgia and, doing Zaxby's commercials like Brock Bowers, or Bryce Young doing Dr. Pepper commercials, and, so many of these players feel like there's no reason to stay in my backyard when I can go play in front of my friends. And now you got schools that part of the NIL is, we're going to fly your family of 4 to every game, give them a hotel, and they're going to still be able to see you, but they're going to see you with 100,000 people instead of maybe 40,000 in your respective region. So I think the pipeline days are just done, because the sport is transient, coaches are transient, and everything is available to be seen every weekend now, instead of the old days where like you could only play in your footprint to be seen.
So from this year's class, who makes up your team of this never would have happened in 2009?
I mean, Keelan Russell, elite in-state Texas kid, is going to A&M or he's going to Texas. And in 2009, Matt Brown has that kid locked up. Well, no, he doesn't, because no, he does, because it was 2010 when everybody was a safety.
Right.
Matt Brown, but he's more likely probably going, SMU probably doesn't even get a chance at him early on, but he's probably a Texas Tech guy. Maybe he's going to go play for Mike Leach, or maybe he's going to go play, at A&M. But 10 years ago, the number 1 player in Texas isn't looking at going to Alabama. And part of that, I firmly believe this: if Texas A&M doesn't leave for the SEC 12 years ago, those SEC schools don't really try to camp out in Texas. They're still focusing on Florida and Georgia. And I mean, you can make a case that Texas A&M's departure from the Big 12 to the SEC did more long-term big picture recruiting expansion than any other school leaving their conference, because once Texas became open to the SEC, then everybody started to try to recruit Texas heavier than they ever did before. And those Texas kids said, well, shoot, I don't need to stay here. I can go play at Bama. I can go play at Georgia. I can go play at Florida. All of those things come into play now, but 10 years ago, that probably doesn't happen.
Yeah, and Texas's quarterback of the future is not a Texas kid.
Exactly.
From Louisiana, yeah.
The funny thing is that, 10 years ago, Les Miles probably gets Arch Manning to stay in state, or maybe he goes to Ole Miss,
Right.
but Sark, with his reputation of quarterback development and Texas being a brand, well, they probably have a better chance to get an Arch than, they would have 10 years ago.
Brandon, we've said a couple times that we're recording this in advance of signing day. How much are you sitting on right now? How much do you know that's going to happen that the rest of us
Hold
don't?
on, we get to see Brandon live. I'm going to try to read his poker face here. All right, continue, Brandon.
There's a lot, and that's why I can't remember if I said it before we started recording, or if I said at the beginning, if a guy doesn't sign on Wednesday, he might be signing on Friday, and it might not be with the school he's been committed to for a year and a half. And there's a reason, because those negotiations are going until the long wee hours. And I think that, we're going to see, we did a piece today. There's like 53 top 247 guys that they're committed, but they might not be committed. And there's still some things that could be happening in the last 24, 48 hours. And I think more than ever, that is kind of where we're at in recruiting. That a kid committed a year and a half ago, and now it's schools like, okay, he committed at school. Now we just know who we're recruiting against. Now we knew who our toughest competition, like Dan said earlier. The market's been set. What do we need to do to surpass that market? So I'm sitting on a lot.
All right, so Dan, this this ran longer than we thought.
Yes.
And we thought maybe this would be a good break point, especially since we're putting out at least 3 episodes this week.
Mm-hmm.
The recap, the spillover, now the signing day show. We've got a preview episode coming tomorrow, just so you all have time to fit all of the episodes in.
There's only so much Dan and Ty.
There's only so much that you want. We get it. We're going to take the remaining 20, 30 minutes. We're going to drop it out on the Patreon feed for our folks at verballers.com. So if you're interested in hearing the full conversation, go on out to verballers.com. You'll see it posted out there. You can download it. You can listen. You can hear the rest of our chat with Brandon. He's so generous with this time. I mean, as I said at the top, he's been one of our longest time guests here. We love having him on a couple times a year. And we really got into it. We really went for it on this episode. So that's where you can find the rest of it.
I got to say, favorite part of the final part of this episode was you starting to ask him a question with, you don't have to name names.
Yeah.
And then I jumped in and I said, Brandon, let's name some names. And he said,
did.
Okay. And he named names. It was
He
great.
did name names.
Yeah.
He did name names. He did that for us.
I love that.
How do you how do you feel about this new era of recruiting? Has the addition of the portal and NIL, all of these newfangled inventions, has it dampened your appreciation for all things recruiting? Has it made you less inclined to follow it? Where do you come down on that?
Well, it's been a particularly good stretch for Oregon, so I've appreciated that from a personal fandom perspective. Yeah, they finished top 3 last year. It looks like they'll finish top 5-ish this year, depending on how things break. We're recording this the day before national signing, or the early signing day. So it's nice to pay a little bit less attention nationally to high school recruiting, because it's been sort of deemed a little bit less important with the portal. And so we don't seem to have the crazy hat ceremonies on signing day, which I kind of miss, but I also kind of am happy that I'm not following that as closely and watching the All-American game and seeing, there is a spectacle to that I've always kind of loved, but it is nice to sort of spread my attention and just okay, what has, is it Pete Nakos?
Nakos?
I'm just Nakos. Let's see what he has to say on Twitter. Okay. So I don't know if he has a term like a Fong bomb for high school recruiting for portal activity. What would be a transfer torpedo? That's just right off. You can have that, Pete. That's all you.
Yeah. We need to workshop Nakos.
Yeah.
Something. We'll come up with something and we'll give that to him. He's never been on the show.
Something with napalm. Nakos,
no,
napalm.
That's got a negative connotation.
It's kind of dark. That's a bleak kind of word.
So,
at least with torpedo, I don't know. There's something sandwichy about it. I appreciate that the sport has become so complicated that you can only be obsessed with the sport to understand what's going on.
And I think that's where I come down on it.
Yeah.
Because you know this about me, and it's probably weird to admit this in public, given that we do a national college football podcast and have done so for, 17 seasons now, something crazy. I've always held the high school recruiting thing at arm's length. I just have never really been able to get into it. I understand its importance, as I've said on this show many times.
Well, you're also like older, as I am.
Well, but
right?
it's got nothing to do with that. It's got nothing to do with that.
Okay.
Recruiting is the lifeblood of this thing. If you're not getting in top talent, you're not building in Alabama and Ohio State or Georgia, name any good team. It's just you need to have that as a building block in your program. Otherwise, it's not going to fly. I've just always had a hard time keeping track of it, to your point.
It's very
following
difficult,
all-American games and how kids are doing in high school and stuff like that. We're so focused on the bigger picture nationally, especially this time of year, where we're talking about games, looking at stats and trying to figure out what the narrative is going to be from week to week.
Yeah, the calendar switch definitely hurt how easy or difficult it is. Like it after the national championship with like 3 or 4 weeks to be like, all right, what's going on with Clemson? What's going on with Stanford? What's going on with Michigan State? That's a little easier in terms of how to handle things as signing day was like February 3rd or whatever.
So that side of it has always been something that I've had a love-hate relationship with.
Sure.
I will say, though, that now that we have introduced the transfer portal, now that we've introduced NIL, the overlap in that Venn diagram, which makes
coaches leaving,
in
the midst of it all. Yeah.
It's all gotten very, very complex, which to your point, only a sicko can follow all of it.
Right.
I have found myself really gravitating towards the portal. And for as depressing as I know it can be, especially if you're kind of a feeder program, which a lot are these days.
Oh, man. But we're not talking about your school, listener. We're talking about your rival school as a feeder program.
That's exactly right. I just appreciate now that we have other things to consider.
Yeah.
And the will they, won't they transfer market is incredibly interesting to me. And the rumors that sort of persist even after the first transfer window closes. I mean, you just have all these odd circumstances that never would have been possible 10 years ago.
Right.
And now suddenly it's all out in the open. We can talk about this stuff, and the ability for players to move from one program to another not only gives them more freedom, which I support, but also makes the sport even more of a mess, which I think is what gives it its charm.
Yeah.
So I'm all about it. I get the pitfalls of it, but for me, it has introduced a level of complexity and has really spoken to my inner sicko, and I'm all here for that.
I'm also here for, with the portal, with recruiting, with NIL, that we are staring at regulation and revenue sharing, like it's going to become more organized one way or the other, which only means one thing, that everybody's going to find a new loophole.
That's right.
To figure
That's
things
exactly
out.
Right.
I can't wait. I can't wait for that loophole. Do I root for a coach who intentionally put a 12th man on the field in the biggest regular season game? Yeah, I absolutely do.
Is there anything better in this life than finding the loophole and exploiting it? And I'm not talking in an illegal way.
Sure.
I don't want to attach a negative connotation to this, but you find a good sale. That's, I guess, part of this. But finding that loophole, exploiting it, feeling like the smartest person in the room for a very finite period of time.
Yeah.
I am here for that. I am all here for that.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate it, especially from players. And the you talk about player movement. If you think it's a bummer, I am totally with you. I totally understand that perspective, that it's become more difficult to keep track of. It's become more difficult to be loyal to a roster as a fan because they might be gone in a year. That's fine. That's a totally good concern. I'm great with that. But seeing players move around that weren't getting playing time or were promised a bill of goods that they didn't get, or have the coach who recruited them immediately leave after signing day, like those are all things that I understand why players should feel good about the ability to move and maximize their value, whatever. And that's a whole other conversation. But the other thing I enjoy about college football, so the thing I enjoy most about college football is the college football, is the on-field activity and all that. The thing that I enjoy about December and to a lesser extent January, and I guess after spring as well, is it doesn't professionalize the sport, but it adds that element of like, if you're a fan of the Houston Rockets or the Timberwolves or the Sacramento Kings or the Washington Nationals or whatever, going into an offseason, like, we need a bullpen, or we need length on the wing. We need stoppers in the low post. We need a lot more shooting.
Well, and it's very, very fitting to compare this on some level to the NBA, because there is this feel of when the portal opens, NBA free agency. It's when they turn off the power grid in Ghostbusters and all the ghosts get out, and it's just pure chaos for some period of time. That is what this is. And I think for as exciting as signing day has been in the past, nothing ever compared to this. This is just like a completely different class of chaos that is very, very on brand for college football. That's why I love it.
It allows us all to enter the phase of being ready to be hurt again once again.
Indeed it does.
We have a tackle from Alabama. Oh, we've got this receiver from FIU. Oh, we have this linebacker from Rhode Island. He's got a lot of big things are being said about him.
You have a tackle from Rhode Island.
I do. Oregon has a tackle from Rhode Island.
Well,
but
close enough.
Like, you fell in love with Minnesota's quarterback based
Max
on
Brosman.
the fact that it would be a great story if he were like an all Big Ten quarterback. He wasn't, but you had the hope.
It's the hope that kills you. Yeah.
It's the hope that kills you. But that's what this sport is. And so I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, where I understand why this is disorienting and discouraging for a lot of people as national fans, as specific fans. But if you can take a step back and appreciate some chaos and anarchy and be a little bit nihilistic, I guess, if nothing even matters.
Yeah.
It's pretty entertaining. It's pretty fun.
It is. All right. Big thanks to our guest of honor today. His name is Brandon Huffman. We appreciate his time, his wisdom as ever. For those of you that are listening on the public feed, as we said a few minutes ago, we're going to continue the conversation. We'll run the rest of it out on our Patreon at verballers.com. In the interim, though, we're going to be previewing games. On Thursday. We've got 9 big ones left to go. After that, we've got another episode forthcoming where we're going to talk about the playoffs and react to that. Everybody's going to be reacting to that at the same time. We're going to be part of that as well. Don't forget, we've also got a stream planned as part of the festivities this coming Saturday night, because it's your alma mater, the Oregon Ducks, against my alma mater, the Penn State Nittany Lions. We're working up something a little special for that, so more to come on that.
Smell Ty's hair, though, will point you to where you need to be.
It'll point where you need to be. Yeah, it'll point you where you need to be.
Smell Ty's hair.
Very, very busy couple days here in the Verballerhood. Appreciate you being with us. Hit follow, hit subscribe. Again, going out to verballers.com to further support the show. For that guy over there, Dan Rubenstein. For myself, Ty Hildenbrandt. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon. Stay solid.
Peace.